The 2000s brought with it the weirdest era of From Software. They released some great games in the aughts, and some really weird and forgotten games. To give you an idea, the company's first game, Kingsfield, was released in 1994, and over the course of the 90s, they released a total of 11 games. That's kind of a lot, but video game development used to be much cheaper and faster, so not unheard of. In the 2010s, their breakout era, they released 16 games, and that's including things like Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, or Dark Souls and Dark Souls Remastered as separate titles. In the 10-year span between 2000 and 2009, From Software released a whopping 40 games, and that's just games they developed, not including things which they only served as the publisher for, like 3D Dot Game Heroes in Japan. That's more than the previous decade and the following decade put together. They were developing an average of 4 games per year, which was a lot even in the pre-HD era of lower budgets and shorter development times. Because of the sheer volume of games they were making at the time, a lot of them didn't make it outside of Japan at all. There were 2 Kingsfield games developed exclusively for the PSP, Kingsfield Additional 1 and Kingsfield Additional 2, which never made it here. The bizarre 2004 mech game Metal Wolf Chaos didn't get localized, probably because of its satire of post-9/11 era American patriotism, until Devolver Digital released a port of it for modern platforms 15 years later in 2019. FromSoft also released several DS games, which are hard to even find any information about in English, which you've probably never heard of. For my money though, the From Software title we really missed out on that I wish we hadn't is Shadow Tower Abyss. Shadow Tower Abyss is a first-person dungeon crawler and sequel to the first Shadow Tower released in 2003 for the PlayStation 2. An English localization was planned but was unfortunately cancelled, and the game has still never been officially released in English. Years later, in 2011, a fan translation of the game was released online though, and you can still find it and play it now fairly easily. I don't think it's a mystery why Shadow Tower Abyss's localization was cancelled. Last video, I talked about the original Shadow Tower, why it was so poorly reviewed and is so tough to get into, and yet why it's still a game I have come to love over the years. If you haven't watched that video yet, I recommend you go take a look at it first, but in short, the reviews for Shadow Tower at the time weren't even mixed. They were bad, averaging in the 2 to 4 out of 10 range. People at the time hated Shadow Tower. And not without reason. In many ways it regressed the already difficult pill to swallow that was the moment-to-moment gameplay of the Kingsfield series. Which is what makes it really unfortunate that of all of From Software's games in the Kingsfield style, one of the very few to never make it outside of Japan was Shadow Tower Abyss, the last game they ever made in the Kingsfield style, and one which showed a genuine path forward that could have given these games a future. Shadow Tower is a very difficult game to recommend because even as someone who likes it, I have to acknowledge all of the problems it has with movement, combat, and even camera controls being so painfully slow and clumsy. That's a real problem with recommending the Kingsfield games as well, even though those do feel better in the hands than Shadow Tower does. Shadow Tower Abyss is the one game From Software made in this style without those issues. Shadow Tower Abyss does not feel bad in the hands. It has analog controls. The camera controls how you want it to, at least if you mess with the settings. The game moves far faster than ever before, the atmosphere and graphical fidelity is only really outmatched by Kingsfield 4, which came out 2 years earlier, and it's far friendlier mechanically than the previous game was. You, yes, you, should play Shadow Tower Abyss, and over the course of this video, I'm going to try to tell you why. It's not a perfect game. In fact, there are some things about it which I think the original Shadow Tower does better, and certainly things which I think the Kingsfield games do better, but if you love From Software's modern games like Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, or Elden Ring, and you've ever been curious about the older games that inspired them but can't get over the hurdle of Kingsfield controls, this is the perfect gateway to those games. Even if you never play another retro FromSoft game, Shadow Tower Abyss contains the elements of greatness that make people like me swear by them to this day. And hey, maybe you'll be hooked, and it'll actually get you to give Kingsfield a try once you've beaten it. Join me as I dive deep into Shadow Tower Abyss and tell you exactly why it's an overlooked gem that never made it to the West. If you've watched my first Shadow Tower video or have played the first game, it's worth diving into exactly what's so different about the sequel. There are a surprising number of changes mechanically that really stand out, especially if you play the two games back to back. There's one really big change though, which you'll notice almost immediately in the game's opening cutscene. Here, see if you can spot it. Yes, that's right. Shadow Tower Abyss is not set in a medieval fantasy world. It's set in something resembling the modern day. Modern enough that there are guns in this game, and not like Bloodborne had guns in it. There are modern pistols, shotguns, rifles, and even semi-auto or automatic weapons in this game. As you might imagine, this changes things significantly. You are still going to want to have a melee weapon in this game, primarily because, as with the first Shadow Tower, resource scarcity and management is a part of this game. Ammo is not plentiful, you get enough to let you use your guns when you need them, but it's not realistically going to serve as your primary weapon until possibly a New Game Plus run of the game. The guns end up, at least in my experience, serving more as a replacement for magic from Kingsfield and the first game, which is weird because magic still exists in this game and works close to identically to how it did last time. You get a ton of magic rings in this game with spells associated with them, but I hardly ever end up using magic in Shadow Tower Abyss simply because guns are often more powerful and the durability of magic rings makes them feel even more fragile than they did in the first game. You get a handful of casts before a ring breaks, while guns are incredibly durable, more durable than your melee weapons even. I've never repaired a gun in Shadow Tower Abyss because a gun has never broken on me, not once. Guns end up simply being more practical than spells, except for very specific situations where you'll want to cast a specific spell that hard counters a specific enemy. Even then, it's not mandatory. You can absolutely make it to the end of Shadow Tower Abyss without ever casting a spell, while that would be much harder in the first game. I kind of like that guns are more practical than spells in a mechanical sense. That's a story trope you see pop up from time to time, that technology is superior to magic because it's easier to use, just less flashy, but I've never seen it expressed this well mechanically before. You can always have two weapons equipped, as in the first game, but it's much easier to switch between the two now. It only requires a single button push, instead of the weird, janky method of hitting circle then triangle, or circle then square to switch weapons in the first game. I did not like inputting fighting game combos just to switch which sword I was holding in the first game. This is way better. That means I end up spending most of the game with a sword or other melee weapon in my character's right hand and a gun of some kind in the left hand. Shadow Tower Abyss also has two-handed weapons, both melee weapons like large two-handed swords and two-handed guns like rifles or shotguns. The first game also kind of had these, but they worked a little differently. In the first Shadow Tower, weapons were always equipped in the right-hand slot, while shields were always equipped in the left-hand slot. There were some two-handed weapons which would unequip anything from your left-hand slot, but you could still have two right-hand items equipped and two left-hand items equipped to swap between, or 4 hand slots total. There are no secondary slots for right and left hand here, you're simply switching between which hand you're using, so two-handed weapons are a bigger trade-off. The menu is still a pause screen, however, so realistically, this is only a time tax because you can swap to a completely new weapon from the equipment menu at any time. You'd think guns would be the biggest change to this style of game, but it's actually only the second biggest. The biggest change is that the game's control scheme has been completely overhauled. There are 4 control schemes available, actually 6, but 2 of them are just inverted camera versions of schemes 3 and 4, and none of them control quite the way previous entries in the Shadow Tower and Kingsfield series have. Schemes 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are pretty similar to each other, just with some specific buttons swapped. I'll save you some time and tell you that if you're a modern player, Control Scheme 4, or possibly 4 Reversed, is the one you'll most likely want. That's the one that controls, like a modern game, movement on the left stick, camera movement on the right stick, attack buttons mapped to L2, R2, L1, and R1 depending on how you're attacking. Obviously, the analog controls make the game feel a lot smoother to play, and that's also enhanced by the speed of the game. If you've been watching my footage of the game so far, and you've seen what playing the original Shadow Tower looked like, you'll notice that it is a much faster game. It's not neon white or anything. By the standards of modern games, it is still very slow and deliberate, but even compared to the game in this lineage immediately preceding it, Kingsfield 4, it's night and day. You move faster and enemies move faster. You attack faster and enemies attack faster. It still has the feel of Kingsfield combat. You're still paying attention to the same things: animation priority, spacing, knowing how many hits you can get in before an enemy attacks, trying to stagger an enemy, but it moves much faster. This is identifiably an evolutionary step between Kingsfield 4 and Demon's Souls, which ditched the first-person camera and consequently refined those same considerations into a much faster and overall better combat system. Shadow Tower Abyss goes down real smooth, even to a modern audience. It doesn't feel like the game is fighting you every step of the way. The reason that attacking needs 4 discrete buttons is because Control Scheme 1, the one which the game defaults to, has a very interesting way of attacking. This keeps the camera controls of the older titles with your look up and look down actions mapped to L2 and R2, and strafing left and right mapped to L1 and R1, with the analog stick controlling your movement with tank controls. This control scheme uses the right stick for attacking and lets you control the direction of your swing based on what direction you move the thumbstick. Flicking the thumbstick left or right will do a left or right slash, flicking it down will do a slow but powerful overhead strike, and flicking it upward will do a stab forward. The most mainstream thing I can compare these controls to is the combat from The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, and specifically the Skyward Sword re-release on Switch, which allowed you to use the right thumbstick in almost exactly the same way. This was released 19 years earlier though, which is pretty impressive. Other points of comparison would be the analog combat from the first Dead Island game, or the mouse-controlled attacking from The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall. The type of damage you are dealing is now determined by the direction you are attacking, rather than the weapon inherently. Slash damage is dealt by attacking with a left or right swing, break damage is dealt by attacking with your overhead attack, and pierce damage is dealt by stabbing forward with your weapon. In other words, if you have a weapon with a high slash attack, you're going to want to primarily be attacking with left and right swings. If it has a high break attack, you're going to want to be doing overhead strikes. If it has a high pierce attack, you'll want to stab forward. Guns also have associated slash, pierce, and break damage scores, and I'm not actually totally clear how your damage type is determined with them, since you only have one type of attack, so I assume it's just dealing a combination of all 3 damage types. That sounds really interesting, and it is, but the unfortunate reality is that this analog combat isn't actually analog, it's still digital. This is essentially just mapping the stick to function like 4 different buttons, like a D-pad, and pressing those buttons by moving the stick in the corresponding direction. Because of that, I see no disadvantage to just using the controller layout where the directional attacks are mapped to 4 buttons. Control Scheme 1 is also really awkward to use with guns because you fire by clicking the right thumbstick in, which feels miles worse than the Control Scheme 4 version where you fire with R1. Control Scheme 1 is interesting. I respect how experimental it is, but realistically, I don't recommend using it, and that's coming from a person who has spent enough time with Kingsfield controls that the looking up and down with L2 and R2 thing doesn't even faze me anymore. I think Control Scheme 4 is not only easier for modern audiences to use, I actually think its combat just controls better. Being able to control which direction you're attacking has a practical use in this game. Shadow Tower Abyss introduces a new element to the series, locational damage. You can hack enemies apart even while they're still alive and attacking you. Hit a goblin enemy in the arm he's holding his weapon with, and it might just fly off, leaving him defenseless for you to finish off. Cut off an enemy's head, and they might not get back up, or they might still get back up depending on what the enemy is. Cut off an enemy's legs, and they'll be unable to pursue you, letting you easily finish them off from a distance. You can do this with guns too, shooting a specific piece of an enemy off, or disarming them at range before closing the distance to kill them in melee. This is still pretty cool now, and it's a lot more ambitious than many later games with similar systems. Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4, for example, have similar systems, but you can't actually shoot an enemy's arm off until they're dead. You can just cripple the arm and prevent them from using it in combat and lower their stats. Shooting a guy in the head in New Vegas doesn't make his head explode until his hit points arbitrarily reach 0. It just lowers his perception stat until then. This adds a layer of strategy to the combat that wasn't there in previous From Software games in this style. It's also just always fun to hack a part of an enemy in a video game off. It always feels good, even in not so great games like The Surge. It's worth mentioning that unlike Fallout or Fear and Hunger, for example, you aren't also subject to this limb damage. This is just something you are considering when fighting your enemies. All of that would already make this game feel very different to the ones that came before it, but they've also completely reworked how stamina, and consequently the entire combat system, works. In the other Kingsfield-alike games, you have a stamina bar in the corner that is fully depleted whenever you attack. That bar then immediately starts to refill. In order to do maximum damage, you have to wait until the bar is full. Attacking while it's empty will still swing your sword, but will do no damage at all, and attacking while it's partially filled will do a proportional amount of damage. The only problem with this system was that the game expects you to read a manual to learn that's how it works. Countless players have tried to go back to Kingsfield, have walked up to the first enemy, and noticed that they're dealing 0 damage to it after the first hit, and have then decided that this is just artificial difficulty and given up. Once you know how this works, it's actually a really elegant way of preventing first-person melee combat from devolving into who can spam their attacks faster. It requires the player to learn the spacing between themselves and the enemy, and to dance in and out of that space between blows to deal damage. This is still operating under a similar idea, but instead of having a single bar that's refilling, you now have weapon gauge and magic gauge nodes, each of which grants you 1 attack. These recharge with time, so the more you have, the more attacks you can perform in succession. Fast weapons, like knives, have more nodes available by default, while a slow two-handed weapon might only have 1 or 2. The number of these nodes available and their recharge speed increases with your stats. I'll explain more during the stat breakdown later on. These weapon gauge nodes work differently with guns, which use the weapon gauge to represent ammo in the way you might expect. Ammo doesn't passively recharge, it's a set amount for each gun, and you reload when you've finished off a clip, needing to find or buy more ammo as time goes on. I really like this. It feels like a genuine evolution of the combat system from Kingsfield without abandoning it entirely. You still have to consider how many attacks you can get in during a specific window. You still can't spam attacks mindlessly, but now you can get 2 or 3 blows in at once, then back off to catch your breath. It feels really good and makes the combat more satisfying than it's ever been before. All of this, the new control scheme, the experimental limb damage system, the reworked combat, the smoother overall feel, makes me really wish this hadn't been the last one of these that FromSoftware ever made. Shadow Tower Abyss was released in 2003, and after that, FromSoft went on to make games like Otogi, Kuon, Armored Core sequels, and Ninja Blade. The only games remotely resembling Kingsfield that were ever released again were Kingsfield Additional 1 and Kingsfield Additional 2, which not only never left Japan, but if you actually look at how they played, they're completely different. They had step-by-step dungeon crawling that makes them more similar to Etrian Odyssey than Kingsfield, and the combat is this weird active time battle type thing that's meant to capture the stamina bar filling action of Kingsfield without the real-time movement. I wouldn't trade Demon's Souls and all the games which came after it for the world. Dark Souls and Bloodborne especially are among my favorite video games ever made. At the same time, I can't help but be a little sad that Shadow Tower Abyss ended up being an evolutionary dead end, because this game proves there's merit to this style of game. At the very least, I think it's interesting to play Shadow Tower Abyss now and get a glimpse of this alternate evolutionary branch that FromSoftware could have ended up going down. As in the first Shadow Tower, you still gain stat points passively by playing the game with each monster you defeat, rather than a traditional leveling system. The stats themselves have been completely reworked here to go with the new combat system. My understanding of how they work, and for that matter how the damage types I mentioned earlier work, is based on a GameFAQs guide created by user Elucidated by Fire, who also has their own YouTube video about Shadow Tower Abyss. I haven't watched their video yet because I tend to avoid watching other videos about games I'm covering, but I will link both the guide and the video in the description below. The GameFAQ breaking down the stats was super helpful, so go check their content out. Stamina increases max HP. Your carry capacity in this game is calculated based on your maximum health rather than any stat directly, so this subsequently increases carry capacity. Vitality increases your resistance to slash damage, slightly increases your resistance to break and pierce damage, increases your weapon gauge count, meaning the number of nodes you have available, and slightly increases max HP and weight. Strength increases your resistance to break damage, slightly increases resistance to slash damage, and slightly increases max HP and weight. Dexterity increases your resistance to pierce damage, slightly increases resistance to slash damage, and increases the speed of weapon gauge recharge. It also slightly increases max HP and total weight. Magic increases your max MP. Concentration increases resistance to element damage, slightly increases resistance to spirit damage, increases the recharge rate of your magic gauge, and slightly increases max MP. Mentality increases resistance to solvent damage, decreases your chance of being afflicted with status effects, and slightly increases max MP. Mind increases resistance to spirit damage, increases magic gauge count, decreases the length of debuffs you've been afflicted with, and slightly increases max MP. It's interesting how there are dedicated stats to increase max health and max MP, but each physical and magic stat also slightly increases those. It's a sort of safety feature to keep players from screwing themselves over by not allocating their soul pod points correctly, and to ensure a player is always getting more health and more MP when they kill an enemy. It sort of reminds me of how the Souls games passively increase your damage resistance as you level up, regardless of where you're putting those points, making you passively a tiny bit more survivable each time your level increases. One big change is that there's no equipment burden in this game at all. You can freely wear your heaviest weapons and armor all you like. Instead, we have a carry capacity for all of the items in your inventory. Exceeding your carry capacity doesn't cause constant damage like exceeding equip burden in the previous game did. Instead, it just slows your movement. That means you can totally just keep going at a snail's pace. I have read online that if you greatly exceed your carry weight, it starts damaging you, but I've never seen that happen. I don't like this change. Encumbrance is a mechanic that makes more sense to me in big open-world RPGs than it does in a game like this, which is more stage-based, and frustratingly, there is no way to dispose of items once you've picked them up, aside from going to a shop where you can either sell them or store them. That means it's very easy to accidentally pick up an item while you're far from a shop, and then have no choice but to slowly crawl your way to a shop while overburdened. This is also replacing a level of strategy that made the first game engaging. There was a careful balancing act in the first game to determine which items you would have on at a time and which you simply couldn't. It added a layer of complexity to equipment. An item might have better stats, but if it's far heavier, is it actually better? This was further complicated by items with high strength actually increasing your max equipment weight when you are wearing them, another thing to take into consideration. I like most of the gameplay changes in Shadow Tower Abyss, but I think this one was a miss. I'm also going to let you know that, as in the first game, many pieces of equipment have special effects hidden in their item descriptions, and as in the first game, those item descriptions are not surfaced as easily as they should be. When you're in the equipment menu, there's a prompt at the bottom of the screen to hit triangle for Guide. It doesn't sound like it would be, but this is what toggles you into the item description, letting you know any special effects the item has. That might be weirdness with the unofficial English patch, or it might be a literal translation of what the prompt is in Japanese, I don't know. But you really want to know this tip because a lot of those special effects are extremely powerful, or on the other hand, extremely painful when you have them equipped. The core gameplay loop of Shadow Tower, the durability, is still present, but it's a lot less harsh than it was in the first game. You still need to juggle weapons and pay attention to durability, but the pressure is not nearly as severe. One thing that really helps is that you now have a little paper doll version of your character in the bottom right for the whole game, showing when individual items are low on durability, which is more convenient than the single symbol which would pop up when something was low in the first game. There are also more shops and save points throughout the game. Shops have been changed around slightly. Rather than trading items for healing potions and magic potions, there's now a shop that lets you trade items for some direct healing proportional to the durability left on the weapon. Repairing items still costs health instead of money, but one unfortunate issue I encountered with the unofficial English translation is that the text displaying how much health a repair will cost is always garbled beyond recognition. Thankfully, the game won't let you accidentally lower your health to 0 and die by doing this, so this is more of an inconvenience than a serious game-breaking issue. Instead of trading items for health potions, you can now sell items in exchange for Qun, the game's currency, at the shop. Of course, you can in turn exchange those Qun for health potions, magic potions, various types of ammo, or whatever else you end up wanting, so this is more of a convenience feature than anything else, consolidating multiple shops into one place. All items at the shop do have a limited amount you can buy, so you'll never be able to outright purchase 99 health potions or 99 pistol ammo, even if you have enough Qun, but the shop's stock is replenished as you progress through the game, so it's not very easy to run out of possible health potions or ammo for the rest of a run either. You can still depopulate areas of the game by killing enough respawns in them, but there's far less emphasis on going through the same areas repeatedly compared to the first game. Once you finish a level, you're pretty much never going to go back to it, so it doesn't matter as much as it did in the first game. This game also includes a true New Game Plus that can loop repeatedly, so SP is no longer a finite resource either. You can potentially keep playing this game until you've maxed out every stat, although I believe the maximum amount of SP you could get in a single run is still limited. Something which I have mixed feelings on is that the shops of Shadow Tower 1 have all been replaced with magic pillars that serve the same purposes, without pulling you into a little side room, instead just functioning as menus. On the one hand, it makes the game feel a lot smoother, since you're not being constantly bogged down by teleporting into shops with long load times. On the other hand, the weird shops you entered and the dialogue you got each time added a lot of personality to the game that's absent here. The biggest advantage that Shadow Tower 1 has over Shadow Tower Abyss is personality. There's honestly not another game quite like Shadow Tower, chock full of weird idiosyncrasies that make the experience both hilarious and memorable. Shadow Tower Abyss is better in many ways, the atmosphere is better built, and the game is actually pretty creepy at points, where I never found the first game unnerving or scary at all, but it traded away a lot of that unique personality in order to get there. The game is taking itself more seriously, and in some ways, that is good because it is able to build more of a horror atmosphere, which I do think the first game was trying to do, but never really reached. The trade-off is that the game's atmosphere, while stronger, is also less strange, and your mileage may vary, but I liked the approach of the first game's goofiness more than the second game's tension. Perhaps the best example of this flatter personality is the monster designs. I praised the monster designs of the first game for how goofy they were, and unfortunately, the little dudes in Shadow Tower Abyss just aren't as messed up. There are a few weird ones here and there, but they are the exception instead of the rule. I've had a lot of kind things to say about the gameplay overall, but there is a problem here. See, for as much depth as the game has, and as many interesting choices as there are to talk about in Shadow Tower Abyss, this is by far the easiest FromSoftware game I have ever played, and for the record, I've played these ones. Now listen. The Kingsfield games and Shadow Tower 1 aren't hard, especially when you compare them to the modern Soulsborne games, but they aren't easy. They are moderately challenging throughout, and there are a lot of points where you'll likely die, where you'll have to reconsider your equipment and playstyle to progress. I know that talking about a game being too easy, especially a FromSoftware game, is a whole can of worms, and that it can come across as gatekeeping. That's not my intention. I'm not saying I want Shadow Tower Abyss to weed out the casuals. First of all, that's stupid. Second of all, no one who is going to play Shadow Tower Abyss can be classified as casual. It's a self-selecting audience. If you are deep enough in the weeds to figure out how to get the English version of a 20-year-old game that was never officially localized working, you have already put legitimate effort into playing it. What I'm saying is, please let me make my case to you for why I think Shadow Tower Abyss is a little too easy. Shadow Tower Abyss has so many interesting elements mechanically. The combat is smooth and strategic enough to be extremely engaging throughout if you play it that way, and you can play it that way, but the thing is, you don't really need to. You can play Shadow Tower Abyss by engaging with the limb damage and all the different weapon types and directional attacks and corresponding damage types, and it is very satisfying. But for most enemies in the game, including bosses, you can just walk up to a guy, hit R2 a few times, and he'll fall over. Even the game's approach to that durability loop, incredibly stressful and tense in the first game, is far more forgiving here. The game throws more weapons and armor at you than you can use, and gear degrades more slowly than it did in the first game. That's unfortunate because the aesthetics are much creepier than the first game, but mechanically the game is less tense. Mechanical tension, the constant fear that you're going to run out of resources, the constant fear that you won't be able to finish the game, is what makes the survival horror genre as scary as it can be. A game with these environments and the mechanical stress of the first game would be a legitimately great horror experience. But Shadow Tower Abyss isn't that game. The game never offers enough resistance to you to force the player to figure out how all of these systems work in a more meaningful way. Cutting limbs off of enemies is really cool, but you don't really need to do it strategically to beat the game, so it just ends up being a nice detail that you sometimes see enemies' heads fly off while you're playing. The only reason I looked up how the different damage types work is because I was making this video. If I were casually playing through the game, I would never have had to understand that different directional attacks were doing different damage types. Most players are not going to make in-depth video coverage about the game's mechanics, and therefore most players will not need to engage with those mechanics. To me, that is the definition of a game being too easy. Back when I talked about Fear and Hunger, I praised that game for requiring you to learn the systems on an intimate level. Fear and Hunger is brutally unfair, and if you just keep hitting your head against it, you're never going to make real progress. Once you start looking at all of the systems in Fear and Hunger, though, and all of the weird interactions that game has, you're able to give yourself 1,000 tiny little advantages, each one meaningless on its own, but together they make you absurdly overpowered. Shadow Tower Abyss gives you a ton of tools, ways of playing the game more strategically that are a lot of fun once you consider them, but the path of least resistance never challenges you and forces you to try them out. I mean, consider what I said earlier in the video. I personally almost never cast spells in this game because I don't have to. Is that good? Is it good that there's an entire set of systems in this game related to spellcasting that I've beaten the game several times now without ever thinking twice about them? I don't think so. This isn't a question of builds. You can beat Dark Souls without ever casting a spell, but there, it's a conscious choice you're making. You are trading off your ability to cast spells for higher physical stats. You are engaging with spellcasting by consciously choosing not to engage with it. Here, because of how stats are distributed, the game encourages everyone to be a jack of all trades, but you don't need all of the tools that are at your disposal. You don't even need to think about them. Multiple difficulty levels would have improved this, offering a deeper level of challenge for players like me who would like it, and added replayability. I'm not calling the game too easy here to brag or to try to shame anyone who has tried to play the game and has struggled with it. If it's your first of FromSoft's retro games, you might have a very different experience, and that's fine. I respect your experience, it's just different from my own. Based on my own experience, I think the lack of a challenge to the game really holds it back from being as good as it could possibly be. Now that I've talked about the game's mechanics in depth, I want to talk about the experience of playing it. As with the first game, the story of Shadow Tower Abyss actually starts in the game's manual instead of in the game proper. Unfortunately, since Shadow Tower Abyss was never translated into English, there's no official English version of this prologue, but I did find this translation from Reddit user GoodLuckMyWay. I'm going to make a blanket statement to take literally every word of text I refer to in this video with a grain of salt, since it's all based on fan translations, but the prologue goes, several years after the Quagmire conflict, a large archaeological ruin was discovered in the war-torn forests of the native peoples. An international research team was formed to investigate these ruins, escorted by a small contingent of armed guards. To pass the time, a certain member of this escort came to talking with a local guide, a man who tired of the current peace. The guard soon took an interest in the old man, who was an outcast among the other guides. The old man claimed to be one of the last surviving members of his tribe that had once lived in the area. According to him, the ruin was originally a sacred place that was not meant for outsiders to set foot in, but with his tribe scattered to the winds and no way to protect the ruins, he had agreed to allow the research team to investigate the area rather than let it fall into decay. As the two grew friendlier with each other, the old man approached the guard with a request. If nothing else, he wanted the guard to bring back his tribe's treasure, hidden within the ruins. Pitying the old man, that night the guard followed him to the outskirts of the ruined shrine. Urged forward by the man, the guard stepped into the shrine. In the next instant, a massive tree root sprang up over the entrance, sealing it closed. From outside the shrine, the old man's voice could be faintly heard. "The hole is shut. The offering has been made." Thankfully, even without an official translation, the story in the manual isn't as essential to understanding the plot this time as it is in the first game, and the opening cutscene does a better job of actually representing it. Shadow Tower Abyss is in many ways less a direct sequel to the first game and more of a retelling or reimagining of the story. One of the biggest differences between the two games is how the Shadow Tower is portrayed. The first game has strange lore implications that the entire tower may be an extension of the demon Belial, contained within the One-Eyed Crown, and each world you traversed was an entire ecosystem contained within a floor of the tower. The tower itself looked fairly mundane though, made of cold stone. The Shadow Tower of Abyss is far more alien and organic. You actually begin the game outside of the tower, sealed within the shrine mentioned in the prologue, which serves as a gateway to the tower, and you are ferried into the tower itself by a Vortigaunt-looking creature that lives within the tower's base, serving as Charon guiding you across the River Styx. The worlds of Shadow Tower Abyss are no longer contained within floors of the tower. You can see the sky in several of them. Visually, the game conveys that the tower is literally connecting many worlds together. It serves as a gateway between worlds, and you are seeing the influence that the tower has had on all of the worlds it has been connected to. Many desolate and corrupted, and others where the inhabitants now live to serve the tower. Obviously, the game is set in something resembling the modern day, and one question that the game never really answers is whether this is actually set in the far future of the world from the first game, or if this is just another world which the tower has connected to. I can't help but point out just how similar this vision of the Shadow Tower is to the titular Dark Tower from Stephen King's Dark Tower series. I mean, Exhibit A, the first piece of text you'll see when you get into the game proper is a tablet that says, "The king dwells in his dark tower," at least in the unofficial English translation. It is a tower that sits at the center of reality, connecting many worlds together, ruled over by a corrupting king. Better than some adaptations to other forms of media that I can think of. The opening seconds of Abyss are incredibly well done. The game begins the moment after our character is sealed within the shrine, and the cold stone walls are lit by a torch that quickly goes out. For a moment, the game is completely black, though you are still in control of your character, and then your eyes adjust to the darkness, and we can actually see what lies before us. Abyss begins with an old FromSoft classic, the instant death a few steps from where you start if you walk forward. As you walk down some steps leading below the shrine, a statue on the side of the path falls over and will instantly kill you if it touches you. This is a common troll in these games, putting something that will instantly kill you right by the start of the game, like Kingsfield 2 starting you positioned so that if you walk straight forward you'll immediately fall off of a cliff and die, or Kingsfield 4 including a weird gravel patch that instantly kills you if you step on it a few steps from the start of the game. I've never really been a fan of these instant death traps. It's not something these games do, except for there being one right at the start of most of these games, so it always feels like you're just being trolled. I think it causes the games to make a much worse first impression than they should, because it sets an expectation that these games are going to be doing this constantly, and they really aren't. There still isn't a full soundtrack for Shadow Tower Abyss, but there is a much stronger audio design in this game compared to the first one. There are not only musical highlights at specific points, but generally a lot of ambient sound, which is what the game was often missing. This is a large part of why the game feels so much better as a horror experience than the previous one did. Visually, the game looks great. It's super dark and atmospheric, and does a great job of selling these spaces as what they are, with a much higher level of detail than the first game managed. The levels of Shadow Tower Abyss feel like recognizable spaces, and the game is generally easier to traverse because of that. I don't really think this is a game where you need to worry about spoilers that much, but if you're interested in playing Shadow Tower Abyss for yourself and don't want to know specifics about the levels in the game and the story, this is where you'll want to stop the video. You have been warned. As I mentioned earlier, the first area of the game is the shrine below the forest, where you're initially sealed. Something interesting here is that the goblinish enemies you're fighting are sentient, and there's a bit of dialogue during one encounter where the one leading them says they're not to kill you, but capture you instead. In an easy-to-miss part of the level, you can find out why they're capturing people. You can find bodies encased in some sort of fleshy cocoons, and find a bunch of smaller versions of these enemies, which the in-game bestiary confirms to be their babies. This is a nursery, and they're webbing up the bodies of those who have entered the shrine like spiders, to either feed their children or possibly somehow birth more of their kind. This is the kind of excellent visual storytelling that FromSoftware have always excelled at. They're known for it now, but it's been in the DNA of their RPGs from the beginning. One thing I don't like about the opening section is the ferry ride at the end of it leading you into the Shadow Tower. It would be okay if you were seeing interesting scenery or set pieces, like for example the Half-Life tram ride where interesting things are there for you to look at, but this is just being ferried down a river in a cave. It's pretty dull. The ferry lets you off in the base of the tower itself, where we really get a feel for how alien this version of the tower is. This blue light area is an interlude with some shops and a little lore, and it seems that these Vortigaunt-like creatures live within the base of the tower, serving the tower's interests. It's here where we encounter a familiar face from the first game, Rurufon, called Ariel in the English version of the first game, the demoness we freed from the body of a doll. Rurufon has a more major role in Abyss, and talking to her is how we get the key to the elevator that brings us to the next set of levels. In the first game, we were descending the Shadow Tower, starting at the uppermost floor and trying to reach the bottom. Here, we are ascending the Shadow Tower, looking for keys that turn on elevators to reach the next floor. These floors often have multiple levels to choose from, which we can tackle in any order, and some of them are even completely optional. The first set of levels we have to choose from are the insect area and the white wall area. The white wall area is a lot more difficult, so you'll want to traverse the insect area first, which leads into a massive insect hive. There's a boss in this level who you encounter almost immediately, but it's completely invulnerable to damage until you find a crystal near the end of the level and break it. Several of these levels give a good vibe that you are intruding in the middle of something that was already going on. As you progress through the insect area, you'll find that there are actually some other kind of bugs, flying ones, that are at war with the ant-like bugs of the colony you're traversing. You can find them fighting each other, and even see some of the ant-like bugs carting the dead bodies of the ones they've killed back into the hive to use for food. Little moments of incident like this are great. The white wall area is, unfortunately, the worst one in the game. You have these little fire creatures as the only enemies here, except for the boss, and it feels like dozens of them were spammed around the level without any rhyme or reason. The area itself is also just a plain cave area without the level of detail that the rest of the game has. Both the insect area and the white wall area lead to the poison area, which I found surprisingly really good for a generic poison cave level. The gimmick to this one is that there are multiple poison fountains throughout the level, and you need to find large crystals which slot into them that purify the surrounding area. The central chamber has all of the poison flowing into it, and unless you turn off all of the poison fountains, the poison there is so thick that you'll die almost instantly if you enter it. There are multiple levels to this area, and a lot of holes that you'll need to drop down, which lead to different sections of the map, making for a fun, multi-layered maze. The poison area contains a key that fits in several doors back in the white wall area. Regardless of which one you place it in, you'll eventually reach the boss, who drops the key to the elevator leading to the next layer of the tower. The next floor of the tower also has 3 areas, but it only presents you with one of them, the Scouring Rush, off the bat. The paths to the other 2 are both hidden within the Scouring Rush. The Scouring Rush is one of my favorite levels of the game, and it also feels the most like one of the worlds from the first game. This area has been overgrown by an enormous plant and is populated by laser-shooting flowers that are very similar to the ones from the Earth world of the first game, as well as overgrown versions of the goblin monsters from the shrine at the beginning of the game, and the insects from the insect area being controlled like cordyceps zombies. The waterfall area is a completely optional level with a gimmick that I'm going to talk about later on in this video, and it's full of really powerful weapons and armor for the point in the game where you find them. This area has some of the game's weirder monster designs, like little dinosaurs with eyes in their mouths and transparent X-ray fish monsters that are hard to see. The cliffs area is another really fun one of the levels that's clearly set outside with the sky above you. This level shows you the game's take on harpies, and I really like this version of the monster because they're a lot more bird-like than most fantasy settings make them. They're sentient, like some of the other monsters in the game, but very weird, and the baby ones especially are super weird looking. I also like that you can find a lot of Cune and other treasure in their nests, implying that they're collecting shiny things like magpies. The Harpy Queen is holding the key to the next elevator. The red sand area is a really interesting one, initially serving as a fake-out ending to the game. You've spent the whole game up to this point looking for a spear that will let you control the tower, and you think you're going to find the spear there, but when you do, it's revealed to be a fake and falls apart in front of you. Then a big dude attacks you, and Rurifon says that the spear is no longer here and it may not exist at all. What's really interesting about this level is its relation to the first game. The monsters here are corrupted humans, seemingly from an ancient time given their armor, and look very similar to the corrupted form Apollos had in the first game, but the corruption is even more advanced. This seems to be a world that used the power of the spear, which is the same as the power of the crown from the first game, and the entire world was corrupted and brought to ruin, leaving nothing but pain and an endless red desert. This might not be the same world that Roos doomed at the end of Shadow Tower, but I think it's definitely another world where the same thing happened. This is us seeing what a world that's fallen to the demon actually looks like, and it's hell. After that, we have another set of areas, first with the Illusion area, which repeats a gimmick from the first game's Illusion world, but has been completely redesigned. This version of the area is a massive series of cathedrals connected by teleporters, which you need to kill mini-bosses to get keys to turn on. Eventually, you are led to the ruler of this world, a more powerful version of some of the mini-bosses you've been fighting throughout. The first game's version of the Illusion world was also built around navigating an area using teleporters and killing several mini-bosses before earning the right to challenge the boss of an area. This is a really great reimagining of the level though, turning it from one of my least favorite levels of the first game into one of the best levels of this one. The final boss of the Illusion area gives the key to the top of the tower. The last two areas are completely optional. You get some of the game's best items here, but both areas have annoying gimmicks I don't particularly like. The fog area has invisible flying enemies who can absolutely melt you with their attacks. The enemies are, thankfully, pretty fragile, but it's hard to figure out where you need to shoot because you can only really tell where they are reliably based on where their projectiles are coming from. This area also shares a gimmick with the last area which it leads into, the moving floor area, which is as described. This area has a ton of moving platforms and a ton of hidden treasure, and you need to switch the direction of those platforms to fully explore the level. The enemies here are the weirdest designs in the entire game, a bunch of strange robot creatures that are honestly hard to even describe. Once you ascend to the top of the tower, you get a final boss fight against Nega Rurufon. Yes, that is what she's called. I'm going to try to talk about the story later in this video, so I won't talk about the boss fight too much just yet. Unfortunately, Shadow Tower Abyss ends very abruptly. It feels like this game is missing a really strong final level like the Death World from the first game, and the whole experience is much shorter than I'd expected. It sounds like there are more levels in this one than in the first, but the areas themselves are much smaller. Each of the areas in Abyss is closer in scope to one or two regions from the first game, with each world there being made up of several regions. By the time I'd beaten Shadow Tower Abyss for the first time, my play clock was sitting around 8 hours, compared to the first game where that time was closer to 14 hours. It really ends up feeling weirdly incomplete from a gameplay perspective, like the game is missing not just a last level, but an entire final act. I won't speculate about why that might be, but whatever the reason is, it leaves the game on an unfortunately sour note, especially since the final boss fight is really easy once you figure out what you're supposed to do. Before we talk about the game's messy story, it's worth looking at some of the specific ways Shadow Tower Abyss influenced later titles in FromSoftware's catalog, as I did with the first game. This section is going to be shorter than it was in the last video because I already hit a lot of the points of comparison. Rurufan is similar to characters like the Maiden in Black and the Doll. Weapon durability was a huge concern in Dark Souls 2, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to reiterate those same points. One of the more obvious points of reference is that there's an item in the game called the Onyx Pendant that has no quote-unquote obvious use. That obvious is a red herring. It doesn't do anything at all. The infamous pendant in Dark Souls, which is also a mysterious yet completely useless item, was almost certainly a direct reference to this Onyx Pendant. The limb damage system is very similar to some concepts in early Souls games, like the Tower Knight from Demon Souls, who is defeated by breaking his ankles and knocking him to the ground before attacking his head, and of course, tail weapons from the first Dark Souls game, special powerful weapons earned by cutting the tails off of specific bosses. The monsters in the poison area are pretty similar to the man-scorpion enemies in 3-2 of Demon Souls, and to show off the game's limb damage, their tails can be cut off similar to how the man-scorpions rocket their tails off after taking a certain amount of damage. Being confronted with a boss who is unkillable at the beginning of a level and needing to find a breakable crystal at the end of the level, which is the source of their immortality, is the entire gimmick of the Seath the Scaleless boss fight and the Duke's Archives area of the first Dark Souls. There are swollen ant-like enemies in the insect area of the game, and a very similar design returned in Elden Ring. Speaking of Elden Ring, when fighting the boss of the Illusion area, Nemesis, who is described in the Bestiary as the one currently ruling the tower, he says that he serves the Great Will, which if you're familiar with Elden Ring lore is very similar to the Greater Will. I'll talk more about that when I talk about the story of the game in a bit. This is the first FromSoftware Kingsfield-alike to include a New Game Plus mode, allowing you to continue playing the game with all of your existing weapons, armor, and stats after beating the final boss. It is a cool addition, but unfortunately it doesn't end up being super interesting because the enemies don't scale up at all, unlike later versions of this mode, which really just makes it a victory lap to go through the whole game a second time with extremely overpowered weapons and armor. To continue the comparisons to Dark Souls 2 that I made in the last video though, this version of New Game Plus is actually a bit more elaborate than the version of New Game Plus that most of the Soulsborne games have, with the exception of Dark Souls 2. You don't encounter additional enemies like you do in that game's New Game Plus, but there are a whole batch of new weapons and armors available in your second run through the game. Some of these items are just slightly different versions of things you already got in the first game. Some of them are straight upgrades like the gold-plated pistol you pick up where you got the combat knife at the beginning of the first run, and some of them are entirely unique items that weren't available in the first run at all. This is really cool, but these items aren't exactly useful since the second run of the game would be trivial even without them. I think the most interesting parallel to the original game of all, though, is that while the first game's encounter with Durin has some Patches flavor, this is really where the legacy of the Patches archetype begins in FromSoft's games, with the man you encounter in the Scouring Rush. Before you enter the Scouring Rush, Rurufan will tell you there's a man there that stole something from her, and ask you to kill him to bring her property back to her. We encounter this man a little later on, and if we talk to him, he'll ask us if we can give him 5 Kyun to help him survive his way back out of the area. He's sitting on a treasure chest, and he's in a room with a locked door. If we give him the Kyun, he'll give us the key to the door, and when we walk into it, we'll find that it's completely filled with dead bodies of people he tricked into entering the room and locked up, and is also full of empty treasure chests. If we open the one treasure chest that's not already empty, it'll explode, dealing massive damage to us. Once we return, we'll find that the man has left, and the treasure chest he was sitting on is empty too. We can then encounter him in the waterfall area, which is the gimmick I was referring to earlier. He'll tell us that he's sorry and will call us over to him, and then as you cross a stone bridge, he'll throw a lever, dropping you into the water below filled with enemies. We're then stranded and have to traverse the entire level to find our way back to the beginning, where we can raise the bridge and exit again, though when I got there the man had disappeared and I never saw him again. If you do kill this NPC before giving him the Cune, he drops a special magic ore, which you can return to Rurufon, and in exchange, she'll give you a soul pod, giving you a little boost to some stats of your choosing. Obviously, if you're familiar with FromSoftware's games, this is just Patches. I don't think any of the Kingsfield games have a character that fits the archetype this well, and this predates any official appearance of a character named Patches by 5 years. The first appearance of Patches in name was in the 2008 game Armored Core for Answer, with an enemy mech pilot named Patch the Good Luck. Patch's name in Japanese versions of the Souls games is actually just Patch from what I've read online, so this is absolutely the first appearance of the character. Here though, 5 years earlier, we have an unnamed NPC that definitely serves as a prototype for the character. It's a neat piece of FromSoftware history, the unofficial first appearance of everyone's favorite thief. All that we have left to talk about with Shadow Tower Abyss is the story, and unfortunately, I think this is another place where this game drops the ball. I won't sugarcoat it. I think Shadow Tower Abyss has the worst and least coherent storytelling of any FromSoftware game that I've played, and again, I've played these ones. It's not that the ideas in the story are bad, and a lot of the individual moments are well handled, but the overall picture is very rough. I'm going to do my best to put the events of Shadow Tower Abyss into some sort of coherent context for you, but if you thought the first game required me to make some logical leaps, I regret to inform you that Shadow Tower Abyss is 10 times more vague and confusing. The story of Shadow Tower Abyss, like much of the rest of the game, is less a true sequel and more a retelling or reimagining of the story of the first game. Shadow Tower was a story-light game, but the scraps of story you were fed were pretty interesting and evocative. In the first game, you are seeking a one-eyed crown that an ancient king used to conquer the continent of Eclipse, before a calamity destroyed his empire overnight. In Abyss, you are seeking a spear that's visually very similar to the crown, and has the same single eye within it, which the Spear King used to control the tower and wield godlike power. The spear was gone, though, by the time you reach it in the Red Sand area, or at least the power had left the spear it was using as a vessel, and I think the boss we fight there was likely the Spear King, having been usurped by the next to take the power. According to the bestiary, the boss you fight at the end of the illusion area, Nemesis, is the one controlling the power during the events of the game, as he is described as the true ruler of the tower, like the demon lord you fight at the end of the first game. Obviously, the one-eyed crown and the one-eyed spear are the same thing, just the demon that controls the tower in a different form. Whoever wields the crown in the first game controls the tower, and now whoever wields the spear controls it. The Spear King and now Nemesis are just like Roos from the first game. They're just links in a chain of destruction spanning countless eras and worlds. Most of the game is pretty story-light, but the structure clearly echoes that of the first game, and now Rurufon is directly leading you to the top of the tower, in a similar way to how Fat Mole was leading you to the bottom in the first game. All of the monsters within the tower are in service of the Spear King, often referring to him as Master, just like we learned all of the monsters in the tower of the first game were being controlled by the Demon Lord we fight at the end. As I mentioned earlier, you find out that the spear is being held in the Red Sand area, and when you find it, it's revealed to be a fake. Once you've beaten the boss that spawns, you can talk to Rurufon again, and she says, "The spear is only a tool. Such power should not be given to humans. The spear is no longer in this world. I wished it so. It may not exist at all. Will you survive or die trying? Will you follow the same path as these fools?" When you face Nemesis on the next floor of the tower, described as the one presently ruling over the tower, he says, "We serve the great will and share in this world. To obey the will, to serve the purpose, for that reason we exist. Your power, however strong, opposes the great will. We must stop you above all else. That is our purpose." Then when you kill Nemesis, he says, "Our destruction opposes the will. However, if it must be so, did we live too long a life?" The idea here, or at least what I think is going on, is that throughout the whole game, you've been hearing all of the monsters in the tower say that they live only to serve the Master, the Spear King, who controls the tower. The boss of the Red Sand area was likely a Spear King, a former ruler of the tower, and we saw how that corruption changed him, but the spear there had been replaced with a fake. The real ruler of the tower during the course of the game was Nemesis, who is likely just another mortal from some world who was seduced by power and is earlier in the timeline of destruction than the boss of the Red Sand area was, but he's just another rube being played by the tower. I think that's what the Great Will he's referring to is. The demon that lives within the crown, or the spear, or whatever other form it may take, influencing countless worlds and countless societies, and bringing them to ruin. Throughout the whole game, you thought the Spear King was behind everything, then you found out it was Nemesis, then finally you found out it's the demon that is the tower itself. One problem with my understanding here is that this does conflict with my idea of how the crown worked in the first game, where I believed that it was genuinely the wielder in control of the tower and not the demon in the crown, but that can be explained any number of ways, like the demon more successfully manipulating those it whispers to, or the demon growing in power as it consumes more civilizations. That's what Rurifon means when she asks if you'll follow the same path as these fools. She's asking if you're just going to be the next in a long line of fools who kills the last wielder of the demon's power and then takes it for their own, becoming just another part of the demon's schemes. But I've already spoiled that Nemesis isn't the final boss, rather it's Nega Rurifon, who is like regular Rurifon but more Nega. Instead of taking the demon's power for yourself, you actually continue on and seek to end it once and for all. At the top of the tower, you find a beating heart, the heart of the tower itself. This context, having already played Abyss, is why I said I think the tower itself is alive, is the demon, in my video about the first game. You hear a voice as you stare at the heart which says, "Our inevitable conflict. This is the fate of the living. You came for your life. We are cursed. Will the end come?" Then Nega Rurifon rushes out and attacks. Nega Rurifon's bestiary description reads, "After long planning, the desired form was achieved." So I think what's going on here is that Rurifon has been trapped within the tower for a long time, unable to leave without taking the demon's power herself. At the beginning of the game, we're actually told that you can't leave the Shadow Tower without the Spear King's power. And that follows what we know. The only person we've seen leave the tower in the series is Roos at the end of the first game. I think Rurifon is someone who has been trapped within the Shadow Tower for hundreds or thousands of years. Her speech earlier, cautioning you not to take the power for yourself like those fools, was actually a trick. She wants the power, she's always wanted the power, but for some reason cannot take it by killing the demon herself. If you've played Dark Souls 2, there are some narrative similarities between Rurifon and Nashandra, the original final boss of that game. Given that she is described as a demoness in the first game, perhaps she's some sort of rival to the One-Eyed Demon, or perhaps she's a lesser demon that wants its power. Either way, she's been trapped within the tower for a very long time, and will remain trapped until she takes the demon's power herself. I think that's why she was following you during the first game, and even asked if you were ready to fight her near the end, despite no such fight happening. If Roos had chosen to try to destroy the tower, this battle would have happened at the end of the first game, but because he took the Demon Lord's place, she had to keep waiting. Her dialogue earlier was kind of clever, saying that no human should ever have such power. The trick to her fight is that no matter how many times you kill Nega Rurifon, she'll just keep respawning and coming at you. It's not an especially hard fight, but you can't beat her with brute force. Instead, you need to attack the heart of the tower. Killing the tower will end the boss fight, and you'll have beaten the game. As the tower dies, she will say, "We both just wanted to live with all our hearts. Endowed with life, embracing life, the cursed." And the game fades to black. It's also really interesting that this is the same trick that King Edward's fight had in the first Shadow Tower, but there it seemed like you were destroying his heart, and this appears to be the heart of the tower itself. I don't know what that means, but it's worth mentioning. After the game fades to black, we get a final pre-rendered cutscene of our character waking up outside of the shrine where the game began. Our character gets up and walks off to the forest, and we see Rurufan, now hornless, hiding behind a tree. It doesn't really look all that much like her in-game model, and she's entirely missing her horns, but the clothes match, so it has to be Rurufan. The game ends by zooming in on her eye, which changes to be the reptilian eye of the one-eyed demon. I don't really like this ending cutscene. I guess it's just telling us that Rurufan and the demon weren't actually killed, and that she's now become the next host of the demon's powers, like the King of Eclipse and Roos and the Spear King and Nemesis before her. Now she's loose in another world, and will bring it to ruin like all the others, becoming just another part of the Shadow Tower. I don't know why she's missing the horns though. It feels like sequel bait for a Shadow Tower 3 that never happened, and the game's ending would have been a lot more satisfying as an end to the duology without it. If I'm right about what's going on in this game, there are some really cool ideas here, but it does feel very rushed and incomplete. Like there's more to this game that was supposed to happen and it just didn't, but they already made the cutscene, so they had to make it work. It feels like this game should have a third act after we kill Nemesis, where Rurufan has taken control of the tower, and we are pursuing her before the final boss fight. Maybe a section that would explain a little bit more to us about Rurufan. One of the weirdest things about Rurufan's place in this game is the side quest you do for her to kill Protopatches. He drops a special magic ore, which is the item he stole from her, and the description says that it reveals the true form of the one holding it. Giving this to her doesn't actually do anything though, aside from her giving you a quest reward. For all the world, this feels like cut content to me, something that should foreshadow her intentions somehow, or change the ending. It's just messy. I think the story I have pieced together is pretty interesting, but even if I'm right about what the story is supposed to be, it is not presented in a coherent manner. There are pieces of a good story here. Individual worlds have really evocative visual storytelling that suggests smaller narratives, but the larger story interconnecting the whole thing feels more scattershot than it did even in the first game. It's unfortunate because, like a lot of things about Shadow Tower Abyss, it feels right on the precipice of being something absolutely outstanding, but it never quite lives up to that potential. That's Shadow Tower Abyss. It's a great game in a lot of ways, and it's by far the easiest of FromSoft's classic RPGs to get into, but it is flawed in a few but severe ways that hold it back. Still though, if you've never played it, I really think you should, whether you're an old school fan of the original game who never got to play this one because it didn't leave Japan, or a fan of FromSoft's modern lineup who wants to see what their older RPGs were like without necessarily dealing with rewiring your brain to understand their archaic controls. Shadow Tower is, as a series, flawed. For everything there is to recommend it, there is another reason to steer clear of it. But the things it did well are so special that you can't really find them anywhere else. I really love both of these games, often in spite of them, and at the very least, I hope you found it interesting to hear me explain why. Often the best pieces of art, the ones that resonate with us the most, are the most flawed, and that is how I feel about Shadow Tower. Janky, slow, often incoherent, but at the same time deeply strange and evocative, and unlike anything else you've ever played. I value flawed ambition more than polish, and both Shadow Tower games provide flawed ambition in spades, which has led me to return to them time and time again. That's what a review score can never capture, and that's what makes a game truly great. If you're still watching this video, then thank you. I made both parts of this retrospective at the same time, so as I'm writing this, I still have no idea if people liked or watched the first part, but please let me know what you thought in the comments below. If people like these videos, I'd be very interested in following it up with videos about Kingsfield 1 through 4 and Eternal Ring in the near future. So let me know if you're interested, and subscribe if you'd like to see those coming soon. If you really liked the video, please consider checking out my Patreon or YouTube channel memberships. I've recently announced a stretch goal where I'm going to cover the infamous survival horror RPGs Pathologic and Pathologic 2 when I reach $300 a month in direct support between the two platforms. And I've also restructured memberships with a new $2 a month tier that provides access to exclusive videos, among some other perks. By the time this video is out, there should be a new supporter-exclusive video up where I talk about 10 recent SCP Foundation articles from the 8,000 numbered series that I like, so if you're interested in seeing that video or some other exclusives, go check it out. Special thank you to my Patreon and YouTube channel member Gold Tier supporters who have pledged $5 or above a month to help me keep making content. Chaotic. Strix 2031. Pizza Requiem. Panozny Korisnik. Rules in Place. Mari SQZ. Raxarox. Mikaru X. Unhealthy Caillou. Sir Darkon. Rachel Aurelia. Devale. Mouse V. Maxine. Lieria. Theodore Divini. Noah Phoenix. The Smallest Church in Wienerville. Gassan Abanura. Patrizia Frabetti. Sninkelberg. Ziggy the 31st. Frondi. Yo-Yo Jojo Mojo. Tsai Voafehi. Dan Luther. Still Just Cow. Jose Armalas. William. Cabbage. Rekka. Alex Smith. Picayune. Hakan Boyum. Pete Lee. Shiny Empty Head. That's All, Bell Mage, and Malachi Murphy. Until next time, everyone, take care.